So, as topics go, I'm hoping I can do this justice in what will not be as long a video as I'd originally planned. Because again, as some who've been watching this channel will know, I have pneumonia in both lungs. So, to be honest, these videos are being recorded between coughing fits. And it's been hot enough over the last few days that you're probably going to see changes in t-shirts, because keeping a t-shirt for multiple days so I can make sure the recording has the same shirt in it the whole way through is not really practical. So I'm apologising in advance on that one. I'd also like to say, be prepared for some bad Japanese. And basically this is the same caveat, the same star that I put up when I was talking about Japanese Naval Aviation Organization. That it is different. And I'm going to be talking about some people who you may or may not have heard of before. I'm going to be talking about some people who you may or may not have known about before. And some things you might have not have thought about from before. And I have to say, this entire video is a product of many, many years of study. And some of it's my own thoughts and ideas over things. Some of it's a distillation of the thoughts of others. And some of it is probably 50-50 mix of the two. So with that being said, with that caveat there, I do expect to say things which not everyone is going to agree with, because one of the problems you have, and I have seen this with a lot of analysis done of Japanese naval aviation specifically, but to also affect British naval aviation and some of the other naval aviation around there, is that post-World War II, there is, as part of the fight to preserve the carrier force in the US, a huge focus on selling the US Naval's carrier aviation arm and its capabilities, which is useful and necessary and helps keep a lot of studies alive. So please do not think I'm critiquing it. But it does mean that then you have, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people come along the idea that therefore, because there's been all this massive focus on US naval aviation, that it's a one-size-fits-all, and everyone must be approaching that problem from the same perspective and have the same problems. We all know that's not the case. We all know, when we really think about it, that's not the case. But the trouble is, some of the people writing it, in that period, especially in the 60s and 70s, in historical terms, in history writing terms, is a very interesting period. There's a lot of very interesting historians who have a very specific structural perspective on world history and how it progresses, that there is a legacy. And that legacy, of course, seeped into popular culture, into the television programs that are made, into a lot of terms of reference. So when I say that a lot of modern naval history and study of Japanese naval forces and Japanese naval capabilities is different from some of the prevailing mantras, that is what I'm talking about and referencing. That is what I'm discussing. And if you find going through this, well, no, I knew all that, then that's very good. That means you are a very informed, very interested person who's gone off and done some study. That's a good thing, and I applaud you for that, and I'm very thankful to you for doing that, because, again, the purpose of this channel is to try and encourage people to go off and do their own study and find their own roots and their own passion into naval history. I want more people to be studying naval history. I want more people to be interested in naval history, because I feel there's so many lessons there for us to learn to make the world better going forward, to make better decisions going forward. And for that, I need people to be going and studying it. So, today's topic: Japanese World War II Carrier Naval Aviation Doctrine, Pre-War to War. Now, as said, I'm going to be talking about some really interesting and random people in this. And so, yes, this has changed from being a Tuesday video to being a Thursday premiere, because there was no chance of me getting it done by Tuesday. There was literally no chance of me getting it done by the Tuesday. So I made it the Thursday. And the Thursday video will hopefully be coming out on the Sunday. And basically my plan is to try and have Tuesday and Thursday videos going through until I'm back. I've been scheduled for x-rays and various things, so hopefully soon. But yes. So this is a continuation of the series which has already covered British Naval Aviation Doctrine of the 1920s and 30s and US Naval Aviation Doctrine. And there are differences between all three of those. So it comes down to an extent to their strategic positions. The Americans are focusing primarily on the Pacific, but their secondary theatre, of course, is the Atlantic. That's their scenario. So they're thinking about large, wide-scale ocean conflict. And their idea is find and strike. Alpha strikes all the way. Find the enemy, strike them, smash them. Bring overwhelming superiority. I.e. the mass Essex class build. All these things. That's what the Americans, our doctrine, is going towards. Curious enough, the Royal Navy is also about mass carrier doctrine, but it's from a different perspective. The Royal Navy is dealing with the scenario that whilst they are going to have to fight in the big oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic are key areas for them again, they're also going to have to fight in the Mediterranean, possibly in the Indian Ocean, but there isn't really much of a threat there, and the South China Sea, because their access route to the Far East is Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Indian Ocean, South China Sea. That's where they're coming. It's a very different route than going cross-Pacific. It's a very different logistical route. It's a very different... There's the British Empire, there's all sorts of things on the way, there's all sorts of supply routes, supply dumps, scenarios, so it's a very different route, and they're bringing very different forces. Again, one of the interesting things with the Japanese and the British is they both develop a similar sort of scenario in terms of they are island nations, and they need to find some way to match up in mass with what's going on, with the quantities that are required for various operations. The Japanese, because of the size of their empire and their scenario they're facing, go very much for the quality and emphasizing quality and almost... it's almost a spiritual way, but we'll get into this more as we go on, and I did cover this a bit in the organisation. The British go, well, we have a massive empire. We bring our mass from our empire. That's where the mass comes from. It's always an interesting discussion when we get into it, because people go, well, you know, the British only provide this many divisions. I go, well, how many Canadians providing? How many Australians providing? How many Indians providing? And that's the thing. That's the strategic scenario. When you're dealing with the British, you're fighting the British Empire. This is why I hate the Britain standing alone the phraseology you so often hear about Britain during the Battle of Britain, or all that sort of thing. Because, yes, we had allies from Europe, from the free nations, but we also have an entire frigating empire. We are literally the largest empire in the world at that point. So, Britain alone is kind of, yeah, you're just, if you shrink the map down to just looking at Europe, yes, Britain's alone. Expand it out anymore and you're going, oh, the Britain's not alone, is it? Britain's really not alone. And that's the reality you're dealing with. And yes, the infrastructure and investment around the empire hadn't been enough. I would say railways in India needed to have slightly more investment, because they presumed that the Indian Ocean being the Indian Ocean and the British being so dominant that they would always have dominance. That truly caused problems during World War II. What can I say? Conceit affects everyone. Everyone has conceit in their planning. But life happens. History happens. So the British have their doctrine, the Japanese have their doctrine, the Americans have their doctrine, and they all reflect their different positions. Because the Japanese, they're looking at fighting in the Pacific, but they're looking at a very specific form of fighting in the Pacific. Because let's be honest, the Japanese are in a rather unique spot. If they're fighting anyone else in the world solo, barring two powers, they can overwhelm them at sea. They can annihilate them. There is literally no one else in the world who can stand up to them. The trouble is, the two powers who are bigger than them can overwhelm them. That's Britain and America. That's the British Empire and America. Those are the two who can completely wallop them. Not just in terms of mass, but in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of construction capability. They might win the first round, they might win the second round, but they will not win the third round, they will not win the fourth round, they will not win the fifth round, and they will suddenly get knocked out at some point, because the trouble is they are going to be a featherweight in a fight with two heavyweights under that scenario. In pretty much every other scenario, they are the heavyweight. But in that scenario, they are the featherweight, and they are facing off against the heavyweight. You can dance around and jump and go, oh yeah, I got some knocks in, I got some jabs in. Great. You won a round on points. However, the moment the heavyweight connects, you're down. And it's not as if the Japanese don't understand all this. The Japanese really do know what they're dealing with. They really do know the scenario they're facing. And so this brings us back to their history of naval aviation, because one of the things you have to consider about them is they have a very different experience in World War I, they have a very different experience forming naval aviation than necessarily other powers do. They are growing their aviation capability, they're growing their naval aviation capability in leaps and bounds, but it's contiguously grown. They don't have the mass expansion during World War I. They don't need it. So they grow it steadily while keeping to their same methodologies of training and instruction selection. Which, again, creates interesting things, but it does also create some very, very fine minds. This is something that has to be understood about the Japanese. They are very good at it. There might not be many of them, but they are very, very good. They're very good at thinking it through. They're very good at coming up with ideas. They're very good at trying to solve the problem. Now, this is also an issue as things go on, because the trouble with when you're smart, and when you know how good you are, is that you can automatically presume you can overcome a problem by just being smarter. I've had this conversation with people in the past. I've dealt with people who have been very skilled fighters, who have been very thoroughly trained. And they have confidence going into any scenario because they believe their training and their knowledge is going to allow them to work out how to deal with that scenario. Usually they get knocked on their butt at some point, because what happens is they get into a scenario where they find themselves dealing with 4 or 5 people versus them on their own, because they thought they could deal with it because of their skill, and actually no, your skill does not overwhelm that amount of mass as long as the other side is not completely stupid. But your confidence is going to get you into that trouble. Sometimes the most difficult people to train to call for backup, or to realise they need to pull out of a situation, are the smartest people. The people who think they can think their way through a problem, because they've always thought their way through a problem. They've always been able to outsmart any problem. The reality is not everyone is... It's very unlikely you're going to be Sherlock Holmes. And even Sherlock Holmes... Well, let's be honest, when Robert Downey Jr. was playing him in a movie, I'm fairly sure he got a bleeding nose and a cracked rib at one point. Might be misremembering that, but still. So, the starting approach to naval aviation and its strategic concept really starts to come from this gentleman, Yûgeki Yamamoto. No relation. No direct relation. It's weird, okay? And he is incredibly smart. His immediate grasp of naval aviation is as an offset strategy. As something which can give you a surprise punch. And surprise can allow you to take out a lot more damage. Surprise from coming from a different angle, different avenue, unexpected direction, unexpected timing, all these things can give you an advantage. It can allow you to turn a stronger opponent's strength against them. It's a very smart approach. Now, If your opponent has 10 times as many forces as you, and you do a surprise attack and they lose 10% of their force, they've lost a lot of ships. They are still 9 times your size though. But we'll leave that to one side. It's still the smartest way to go, is to try and think about this as an offset strategy. As an approach to naval aviation whereby Japan would have an edge if they're facing a larger power. And that is what Japan is consistently thinking about, because their only real threats are larger powers. It's kind of like Britain and America in the 1920s and 30s. Britain and America are always wargaming, fighting each other. Why? Because the other one is the only power who's the same size as them. It's the only one that's a real massive threat. So they wargame it because that's the best challenge to set people to try and work out. You don't wargame fighting someone who's a minnow if you're a shark. There's no point. You wargame fighting someone who's another shark. For Japan, well, their problem was threefold, really. One, their access to resources were limited and hemmed in by empires. Whether it's the American informal mandated empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, or the French Empire, or the Russian Empire, or the Chinese Empire. All these are empires. But the thing is, the reality is that most of those empires, most of those problems, rested on two large naval forces. One of which was the force which they had traditionally considered their protector, and one of them was the force they considered the real demon. You have to understand, at this point, if I give you a current reference example, one of the joys of life of whenever you're dealing with Russian-focused information coming out of the moment, they have a habit on focusing still on Britain as the traditional enemy. Because it was the British Empire and defense of the British Empire which often thwarted Russian territorial expansion for about 200 odd years. So whilst America might be the current enemy, or NATO, whatever, Britain's always referred to as the traditional. And is always in there somewhere in their psyche. We've been mucking around with that for about 200 years. It's kind of like us with the French. It's our summer home. The French are where we work, the Russians are where we go for our summer vacation. That sounds so sarcastic and, flippant, but it's true if you look at that period. Through most of the 19th century, the main problems Britain was dealing with were the French keep considering having an empire, and the Russians keep trying to expand their empire in the direction of India. And so Britain doesn't actually want to fight wars with either of them, because wars are expensive and annoying. So they spend most of their time doing conflict management or psychological warfare, depending on your perspective. Various British governments practice this to lesser or greater extent, and achieve varying levels of success. Sometimes the ones which actually do it least achieve the most success, but sometimes the ones which do it most achieve the least, but also vice versa. Well, with Japan, that traditional enemy is America, thanks to Oliver Hazard Perry, and what he did when he opened up Japan. Yes, it caused a huge psychological trauma. It was a national-scale, significant emotional event. And this is the problem. This is a foundational issue and a problem in American and Japanese relations. That in this period often went completely ignored by the Americans. They honestly, some of their leadership could never seem to understand why it causes a constant mistrust. But basically, Japan itself isolated itself from the world. It was a great nation, it was happily hopping along on its own, and pretty much it's rammed open because people want access to the silver in Japan to help them with buying goods in China. Yeah, they want access to Japanese raw materials and markets to sell to in order to help them with the global silver trade, which underpinned the global economy at this point. And let's be honest, does again today. People always think it's gold which makes the world go round. Nope, it's silver. Silver trade, international silver trade, was the biggest commercial driving force for about 400 years of the world's global economy. And Japan was the closest source of silver of decent quality to China. And so if you want to trade silver, if you want to trade stuff with China, you need to be able to buy in silver. And in order to do that, you really need a source of silver which is close by, because otherwise you're traveling, carrying across from South America or from Europe. And that just makes it expensive. So all this in mind, that means Japan is looking at an offset strategy approach to procurement from basically the beginning. This probably sounded like a whole meandering thing, but I'm trying to give the context for what their history is. So the moment they're approaching naval aviation, even in 1912, 1916, in this period, when they're setting it up, they are looking at naval aviation as something which is going to give them a capability to offset someone else's strength, because they've been through that trauma. And they know why they went through that trauma. They're not stupid. As I said, again, they are not stupid. Their World War I experience showed the capabilities of aviation. It showed their capabilities both to support operations, it showed it as a strike capability, it showed it as a reconnaissance capability, and it showed it as something which they were going to need. And Tsingtao was a great example of them needing it and using it. It truly was. And now we've got to a shameless book plug. About 22 minutes in. So once again, it's a shameless book plug, and I have to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for everyone who has downloaded these books, who has bought the first edition, which was the hardback version, the paperback edition, which was the second edition. I'm hoping enough gets sold, I get to do a third edition and get to add in an extra chapter. That's my plan. And there are more books hopefully coming. There's going to be a whole thing at some point. And the only reason I'm saying at some point is because I'm still coughing like, well... To be honest, I sound like I've been smoking 60 a day for the last 30 years. All the pain, all the bad cough, none of the pleasure on the way. Ah well. It's better not to, trust me, and especially not if you're someone like me with my family background. There is emphysema from grandfather, heavy-duty asthma with both my mum and my sister, variations on asthma. They have the full spectrum. It's fun. And lung cancer and various other relatives, etc. I was literally the person given the conversation by my GP, who had known me since I was born, which went along the lines of, for other people, smoking is a gamble or a risk. With your genetic heritage, smoking is, well, it's just quicker to just shoot yourself. It honestly is. So, less painful as well. It's always nice when you have a general practitioner who is just that frank with you. She was one of a kind. But no, this is my book. This is about Travels, Battles, and Darings. It's the one you can buy at the moment. There are going to be more books soon. And at some point I'm going to do... I've got some ideas for not just some 45,000 word books which are going to be digital releases, and not just a book which is on about preparing for war, the three biggest navies and their preparations for World War II. How they were strategically gearing up, how they were selecting and procuring. That's something I would love to do. Something I would love to produce. It's sort of right up my bailiwick, and provides both engineering and strategy. But we'll see. We'll see. But no, thank you to everyone. And thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. It's really a great time to get pneumonia. We're in the middle of moving house. Have to buy a new bed. And I mean literally have to buy a new bed. The bed I have at this place at home. It's I've managed to keep it going for years, but it got broken and I've never got around to getting a new one because bookshelves were always more important. But at this point, when the movers came around to look at our house, they looked at my bed and went, we don't want to put that in our van. We're worried it's going to collapse. I can see why. Many years ago when I was young and there were builders in the house putting on the extension, they didn't realise quite where they were drilling, and they were actually drilling too high, and they went through the wall and through my bed with a big long power draw. You can imagine what that did to a bed frame. Anyway, fun times. Fun times indeed. So let's start off with the strategic reality of Japan. Japan comes out of World War I with some economic strength behind it. Whilst it's to a lesser extent than America, it is a far greater extent than Australia. Japan comes through World War I with an economic boost. They have enriched their armaments industry. They have had very good employment. They've had very good trade opportunities. They've been able to get involved in international banking and get involved in loans. They've been doing all sorts of things. One of the interesting examples I can give is the Japanese are actually selling British pattern weapons they've manufactured in their own British pattern works they built themselves to the Russians because they are running short of guns. So the Russians are literally replacing weapons, a fair number of which got destroyed during the Russo-Japanese War, with Japanese-made British weapons. British design weapons. That's cute. But that's some of the realities they have going on with World War I. And also, for most of that period, they are heavily linked into the British Empire trade network. They really are. How Britain worked out with the Anglo-Japanese alliance was, we will not just be your ally, we'll make it so you can trade within our empire. That's how you bind an ally to you. You say, this is our global trade network. You need to grow your economy to survive. Here, you can piggyback on our network, and in return, you'll be our ally. And they piggybacked on that. They integrated into the technological exchange and race, and this is the fun thing about the Dreadnought race. If we completely ignore the quantitative race between Britain and Germany, there's this qualitative race going on. I've discussed this a few times. That race involves Italy. It involves Japan. It involves America. It involves Britain. Germany, arguably in a tech perspective, because of how slow they are at pushing it forward, ranks but quite far down the road of countries involved in the Dreadnought race. You could argue they're behind the South American nations. And the reason for that, of course, is Germany is trying to maximize the build they can get from their infrastructure industry at the minimum cost, so they don't want to push the tech forward, because if you push the tech forward, you push the expense forward. It's not saying they couldn't do it. They could do it. It would have required more money, though. And they didn't want to spend that money because of the way things were structured, and they didn't want to get into a fight with the army, the Heer, because they got into a fight with them. Well, let's be honest, I've done a video about that. It doesn't go well for them. Basically, they get into a political fight with the Heer, they lose every single time. That's the truth for the Kaiserlich Marine. Tirpitz can do all the dreaming he wants. He isn't going to win a political fight with the army. So, and that's again, I've done a whole video about the reality of why the British were building the Queen Elizabeth class and why they didn't build the R's, because they knew that if they bumped the cost up that much, bye-bye Navy funding. Because the moment it crossed the threshold, it started to interfere with the Army's funding, it was going to get cancelled. That was the entire British plan to win the quantitative race. Well, with Japan being part of that tech race, how did they manage to build themselves into that tech race? Well, using the British network. One of the joys about the tech race, and this is the really cool thing of the Dreadnought tech race, is there are certain companies whose designs crop up in almost all the nations. Parsons turbines. Everywhere. As far as the eye can see. Brown. All sorts of companies are critical for what's being built. And the Japanese use this to build themselves up. They use this integration into a global economic system. They use all this to build themselves up. The reality was, though, they probably needed about another 15 years at least as part of this network before finding themselves in a situation they did post-Washington Naval Treaty. The British were prepared to keep them within the trading sphere to an extent, but they were no longer allies, and the British was prioritising their own redevelopment post-World War One, and they're dealing with their other issues post-World War One. So Japan drops down the priority list. America, of course, is a competition, and America and Japan are, of course, both competing to an extent to try and take over the economic markets, which, to an extent, the British have had to abandon because of restructuring their industry around military supplies rather than commercial, personal supplies. America has access to huge amounts of resources to do this. Huge amounts of raw materials and huge amounts of funding. Japan doesn't. But in this scenario, Japan does have skill. What they find themselves increasingly facing is a strategic reality with this as their economic background. Their economy, they can do as well as they can. They can push it as hard as they can. But there is a limit to what they can achieve. There is a limit to the rate of acceleration they can achieve. Education is one of the bottlenecks. Infrastructure is a massive bottleneck. It's the problems we see with Japan in this period are really solved by the reforms which in many ways are started off post-World War II by the leadership of such people as Mitsumasa Yonai. Post-World War II. Prior to World War II, there is a significant group, especially those who are still, I would say, not just living with, but still living out the trauma of the way Japan was opened up to the world, who are very much the belief of might makes right, and that they can be the might. Now, the thing is, whilst having that group of people, whilst they are there, those people don't necessarily set the structure and planning of the strategic approach. In fact, a lot of the strategic approach of Japan is fundamentally very sound. They are looking at their realities. I've already discussed the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, as far as the world is concerned, they can boot stomp pretty much everyone else other than two powers who can boot stomp them. That's it. They are powerful enough that they can do hefty damage. They can take out pretty much everyone. Now, think about that. In the 1920s and 30s, Italian fleet versus the Japanese? Goodbye. French fleet? Sayonara. It's just not happening. Solo. Just not. But, and this is the big but, those nations are also not Japan's problem. Japan's problem is if they want to fix their economic needs by anything other than massive internal reform, massive societal reform, and a massive infrastructure investment, which will cause all sorts of NIMBYism to have to be dealt with. And, by the way, NIMBYism, as it stands for Not In My Backyard, it's not something which is peculiar to the UK, but sometimes I think the phraseology is peculiar to the UK, and that there's always people who would like development. It has to take place elsewhere, not in not in their area. You know, yes, we need a railway line built, but it can't go through our part of the country. It's the flattest, straightest route. But this is a beautiful piece of country. It is a beautiful piece of country. Fine, we'll build a tunnel. Oh, is it going to be deep enough? Is it going to... Oh, God, help me. This is what you have to deal with, and you have had to deal with that forever. I'm fairly certain in the feudal period, you know, medieval times, when someone announced they were going to build a castle, someone would put a hand up and go, but that's going to spoil my view. I just fondly hope that whoever said that then received an arrow straight through the head. That's my fondest wish. That basically the castle builder looked at them and went, Archer? Anyone else want to complain about my castle spoiling their view? Nope. Good. The trouble is, NIMBYism can be also not just about physical things. It can be about not embracing the necessary change. I.e., the necessity of maybe widening a pool of education. Maybe changing your approach to education. Maybe widening the pool of potential people who can be officers. Who can be in charge. Listening to a wider pool of capabilities. And that can be scary. That can be truly scary. But still, strategic reality was that Japan can't win an offensive war against those two big powers. And defensively, well, in terms of land, they'll only be fighting them once they've landed on Japan's soil, which isn't really a good scenario for them. So you've got to think about how to fight a naval war defensively. And that's some interesting history to examine and some interesting strategic thought to get into discussing. It's also a bit weird, but it's worthwhile. And this really illustrates the challenge in the 1930s. All those with British flags on, or variations of British flags, and there's also South Africa, etc. in there, and a few other interesting mandates, which are also around in various places. They're the British Empire. Japan is tiny. America is concentrated, but also pretty darn massive, and you have to remember, this is one of those projections which actually shrinks certain things and makes other things bigger. It's quite a lovely map if you're the UK, and makes us look very big. It's not such a good map if you are Australia, for example. It shrinks you a bit. And certainly many African nations it shrinks. Even some European ones. So their challenge and their strategic reality are they have a strong economy which is getting stronger, but isn't strong. And it's got weak fundamentals. And they know this, and they're trying to improve it. They have a strategic position which basically depends upon the sea as their defensive depth. And this is in an age where you do not have satellites, so You have to find the enemy coming to you before you can do any defensive stuff. And pretty much the only powers who can attack them are the two biggest powers in the world. And they have quite a lot of facilities nearby to do nasty things to them. That's not a good position to be in. That just isn't a good position to be in. So these are some of the... And I have picked out 4 of... Well, how do I put this? I picked out the subtle thinkers. When I wanted to give you images of people to talk about and names to talk about for this, there is, of course, a wide cohort of people who are involved in the analysis in Japan. But in my experience of working with Japanese and of dealing with Japanese, it's often not the loudest voices which have the most impact. In fact, whereas to an extent in the UK and US, Mahan, especially, is a good example, is, articles, etc., in newspapers, and Corbett with writing books which pretty much do target politicians. They are playing into their systems. In Japan, the loud, noisy ones, they will be very visible. They're very easy to talk about and they're very easy to find, but it's the quiet thinkers who have some of the biggest impact. Yamamoto probably is the most famous name here, Isoroku Yamamoto. And he's most famous for what he does during the war. But he was part of trying to assess and set up the fleet and everything prior to the war. There is Sato Tetsutaro, who is the Japanese equivalent to Corbett and Mahan. And the writings of his I have managed to read, and I would like to say not enough of his work is translated to English. But the writings of his I've read, and the stuff I've even managed to read some of the Japanese. This work was especially useful. This is actually a work which was a bit of a compilation of his. It was really worth reading. It's both a compilation and a discussion of his work. But it's all entirely in Japanese, so please note. Yeah, I do have to read it with my phone, because my Japanese reading is not that good yet. He is a foundational thinker for the Japanese strategic concepts. And fundamentally, this starts to come up with the idea of, we can't win a total war, so how do we manage to force this to be a limited war? That's their gamble. They cannot win a total war versus the British Empire or America. They can't. Okay, there's just too much resources on both for both those powers. I know people will always, sometimes people do the analysis of Britain versus America, and they go, yeah, well, it's more equal. No, you've got to think of it as the British Empire, because Britain at this point can marshal its empire. Yes, there will be arguments. Yes, there'll be debates. Yes, it's far closer to a family than a unit. But as a rule, quite a lot of it will follow along. And the bits which will possibly disagree will also end up following along, because it's more in their interest in this time period for them to do so than to not. Then you have Mitsumasa Yonai. He's one of those people who, the more you study, the more you find he's doing things, the more involved and connected he is. He is a naval officer and a senior admiral, and he is what I would call a quiet fixer. In fact, I would say at least 3 of these personalities are quiet fixers. They are people. While Tetsutaro does writings and does all sorts of things, Yonai is far quieter. He writes poetry. Has a few works, but mainly poetry. But he is known and understood and valued, not just by Japanese officers, but by officers from Britain, America, and other places in the world, for his knowledge and skill, for his fortitude, and his words of wisdom, his quiet competence and wisdom. He's certainly not beloved by some of the factions within Japan. He is their militaristic faction, especially, do not like Yonai, but they also, interestingly enough, never move against him. And I would say that's down, in large part, down to his reputation for quiet competence and quiet capability, and he's instrumental to keeping a lot of these people alive. It's actually arguable that he ends up as Prime Minister because this gentleman, Takahashi Koriko, who is probably Japan's economic savior in this period. Honestly, the person who has the best understanding and best capability to actually keep Japan's economy going and growing is Takahashi Koriko. He is probably one of the best pragmatic economists a country's ever had as a finance minister. I'm not saying he's an economic theorist. He really isn't. And if you tried to copy exactly what he did in Japan, it probably wouldn't work again. But he is absolutely excellent at doing the best he can to get the best out of the Japanese economy and support it as best he can. And for that, you have to thank him. The fact he ends up being assassinated, and his assassination leads to all sorts of a series of issues economically that pretty much causes problems for Japan economically until Yonai becomes Prime Minister and fixes quite a lot of those issues whilst he's Prime Minister in his short tenure, is really intriguing. Because pretty much the militarists who assassinated Koriko didn't understand that he was the man who was making sure they could pay for all their toys. They could pay for all their systems because he was keeping the economy going. But they wanted him out the way. Because what he was arguing for, what he represented, was change. And of course we have Isoroku Yamamoto. Now, why have I got all of these people here? Why are these people involved in this strategic assessment? Because you need a fundamental understanding of your economy before you can work out how to defend it. You need to fundamentally understand your strategic position before you can work out how to defend it. And you need to fundamentally understand strategy as it applies to your situation before you can defend it. The interesting thing about these 4 gentlemen, Yonai, of course, is the only one who actually survives World War II. Assassinated beforehand, dies in 1942, and of course is taken out during the war. They also belong to different factions. They're not necessarily, Tetsutaro is definitely of the fleet faction, and always arguing for a larger fleet, but to be fair, he is the Japanese equivalent of Mahan and Corbett. What do you expect him to do? And to an extent, I would suppose also the Japanese equivalent of Vice Admiral Column, probably. But I would argue he's more effective than Column is. Column is in many ways completely overwhelmed by Corbett in terms of a period and persistence, but he's important. So these are 4 of the key thinkers who are shaping and moulding the discussion. Again, subtle thinkers in terms of a strategic discussion will often work by setting the framework of that discussion. They won't necessarily guide and fill in the gaps, but they'll set the framework for it. It's a rather Kantian approach to the scenario and the discussion debate, where Kant, with his philosophy, tends to provide a framework that you can build a ship of your own philosophy around. Well, it's similar when you're trying to shape a discussion debate for your own country's national defense. You can, with very quiet inputs, shape and critically define the framework. Then everyone else is just arguing about how you put on the hull and how you put what engines you use. But you've defined the ship. You've defined the framework. And that's what they do. That's what these four definitely do. So let's consider their wider strategic doctrine they are adopting. Okay, limited war doctrine is something which is kind of interesting. It's really something which is peculiar to island powers, or powers who have significant bodies of water for their borders. I.e., pretty much America can get involved in a limited war, Britain, Japan. Anyone who doesn't have a land border with a pier, who can keep their piers over the other side of large chunks of ocean, can wage what is called a limited war. And there are two reasons you might choose to wage a limited war. It might be to preserve your own strength. So rather than going for full total war, go for a limited war approach. Absorb the enemy's hits, but deflect them, deflect, disrupt, delay, destroy them. Those are your options. And use that to strengthen your economy while they're having to put everything into their economy. A good example of this is the British and Napoleonic Wars. The British do a limited war. They are using their naval capabilities to deploy forces here and there, but mainly they're using it to secure control of the sea and take over colonies, but specifically take over sources of income. So they are boosting their economy and boosting their trade at the cost of their opponent's trade. And this wears down your opponent economically. Now for Japan, limited war is actually a very attractive methodology. They don't have much strategic depth once you get to the islands, because of the way the geographical form of the islands and the geographic form of their territory. There isn't really a lot of depth going on there. In fact, it's quite exposed. Honestly, a good battleship task group can do a lot of damage to most of Japan's vital infrastructure. Now, this means for them, they want to keep the war as far away from them as possible. So you want to go for some kind of limited war doctrine, because you want to keep the war as far away from you as possible. But that becomes a problem. That becomes a problem when you're facing powers for whom they also would be waging limited war, but whose resources under limited war far exceed even your resources. And who, if they go into anything approaching a total war mobilization, can overwhelm you. That boot stomp reference earlier. Now, this is where naval aviation really starts to come in for Japan, because aviation is one of those areas where immediately quality of aircraft and quality of pilots can have a big impact, can have an outside impact. Now, the quality of aircraft I'm talking about, because I know someone's going to write here, oh, this aircraft wasn't as good as that aircraft and all these things. No, we're talking quality of aircraft as it fits to your doctrine. And the Japanese doctrine for naval aviation is interesting. It fits in within one of their key strategic concepts. And we'll be talking about, once we go through their key strategic concepts, which one it fits most in. But they are pursuing a limited war doctrine and a conflict management doctrine for dealing with major powers. I would argue this is also one of the reasons why they have the problems they do in China. and when they're fighting the Soviets, because they haven't pushed down a total war doctrine, they haven't done a total war mobilization, they haven't done the investment in infrastructure they need to. Let's be honest, the Soviets have a huge amount of tanks. They're not very particularly good, but they have a huge number of them. Morale and infantry and is not going to overwhelm that kind of technological edge. And when you've got a navy which is pursuing wholeheartedly technological edge as its way to make up for its numbers, there is already a basis going on there within your country for pursuing a technological edge. For Japan, some decent tanks could have been force enhancers. They really could have been. Some decent tanks could have caused truly a lot of trouble for the Chinese, and even for the Russians. I'm not so sure any amount of good quality tanks are really going to make much of a difference for the Japanese in the island hopping campaign. Maybe in the larger islands, in sort of the Indonesia, Philippines area, then the tanks would possibly have an impact, and Malaya they'd have an impact. But yeah, they're not going to have much of an impact in the island campaign. But let's start considering this. Now, I know I've discussed it before in other videos, but I'm going to discuss this again because these are the terms of reference you need to think about. The Teikoku Kokubo Hoshin, the Imperial Defense Policy, is not always the same thing as Teikoku Yohei Koryo, the Imperial Defense Doctrine. Policy defines the terms of reference for your doctrine. But your doctrine can also inform your policy, because it can inform how you phrase your policy. Okay? So, these documents are not necessarily the same, but they will feed into each other. These things will feed into each other. The first sets are published in 1907. They are revised again in 1918. In 1923 and 1936. Prior to this, they do have documents laying out these things, but pulling them together and calling this is a different statement from 1907 onwards. But they do have, from the original purpose onwards, they do have, from basically 1890s onwards, they have documents fulfilling this role. And this is not unusual. The Japanese approach to defense and their security operations is roughly analogous with the Americans' approach to a codified constitution. But instead of having lawyers fighting over its terminology, it's usually military personnel deciding to have duels over it, for want of a better description. And it defines, in pretty much all these documents, something along the same lines of: the Navy shall conduct operations aimed at annihilating the seaborne force of the enemy insofar as possible by forestalling him and the army at gaining the advantage of holding initiative by rapidly concentrating the required forces in the area before the enemy can do so. The key point is: the Navy shall conduct operations aimed at annihilating the seaborne force of the enemy insofar as possible by forestalling him, i.e., preventing him reach a decisive area. They have ideas for this. Now, one of the interesting things is usually we get into discussion of Taiken Kiyoshugi. I know someone wants me to start talking about a Kantai Kessen and various other things in a bit, but I'm sure there's someone already going, what about the Kantai Kessen Decisive Battle Doctrine? We'll get to that, but the Decisive Battle Doctrine is actually way down the list. It's the sexiest part of all their doctrines, I do know that. This is why there have been so many videos where I've had to discuss the Kantai Kessen on this channel. But it's not the one we're getting to right now. So, Taikan Kiyoshugi is a defining policy behind Japanese ship construction and a deterrent conflict management tool. The idea of making their ships individually more powerful than any of their opponents. Individually more capable than any of their opponents. Because they, again, can't have as many. So it's having this tech edge, this visible capability edge, a qualitative edge. They basically, Japan, unlike Germany, looks at the scenario and goes, we do not have the infrastructure to achieve a quantitative edge over Britain and America. We just don't. So we have to go for a qualitative edge. And that's where Taiken Kiyoshugi comes in. And it really does define their shipbuilding and their construction. It doesn't always lead them down good paths, but it's a conflict management / deterrence tool when it's used properly. That's certainly how, to my mind, I would say Tetsutaro, Yonai, and Yamato are looking at it. Kurikyo is less involved in this one, but I would say those three are certainly looking at it as that. The trouble is especially the dominating faction in the late 1930s, early 1940s, from the army, views all these things as being strategic surprises. The trouble is strategic surprise, and there is a faction within the Navy which has the same idea. It's a strategic surprise to have this capability. When you need this capability as a deterrent to buy you time, to enforce your enemy to proceed with a level of caution. Basically, the idea is that you hope the enemy groups up solidly instead of sending in multiple forces that you have to track in various areas across this wide area of ocean you have to defend. That your enemy goes right, and because of these individual capabilities of these ships, we have to concentrate our fleet. Yes, we'll win. Yes, we will win, but we need to be concentrated in order to sure we'll win to be able to beat this capability. That's what you want. Ideally, you want the enemy bunched up as much as possible. You want a single-massed enemy fleet coming towards you with everything in one hulking group. Because that's going to be the easiest to find, because it's going to make the most noise, both by radio signals and visually. That's going to be, therefore, the easiest for you to concentrate your own forces to engage and harass. And that's going to be the easiest to predict the movements of. If you're trying to manage, as the British Admiral Cunningham is the absolute master of this in the Mediterranean on a regular basis when dealing with the Italians were quite good when the British were running 1 or 2 large convoys. When they had about a dozen convoys running through, plus the fleet plus Force H and the fleet doing different things, and Force K wandering around having fun, that's when the Italians were going, what the frigate are they up to now? Because you reach a certain level of command overload, of information saturation. There is such thing as having too much information. You can have too much information to be able to make decisions. So, big ships, big guns, they're about managing that conflict, deterring conflict, and with conflict comes forcing the enemy to concentrate their force, because Japan can't spend its money on a large quantity of things, so they have to spend on a quality of things. And this is the key point. Yûgeki Zengen Sakusen. Interception and attrition operations. This is probably the key defining scenario for a lot of what Japan is thinking about in its warfighting scenario, in the warfighting situation. Now, the point with this operation, this strategy, is that attacking the US Asiatic fleet, that was going to be a primary role of carrier naval aviation. The idea was that basically you have island-based aircraft going out searching, you have cruiser-based aircraft out searching for the Americans as they respond. And it's a very simple idea. It's basically destroy the enemy fleet in the Philippines, and the Americans will charge across the Pacific as a mass force coming out of probably San Francisco, but maybe Hawaii later on. And as they came across out of rage, you will then attrit them. Now this starts to bring in what you want from your aircraft, because the Japanese don't go for night aviation, night flying as much as the British do. They do have some units which are capable. They do have some personnel, it's kind of like the Americans. They have some capability in it, but honestly, there isn't enough advantage in it for them to pursue it. For the British, one of the reasons why they overlook the risks of night operations, and there are significant risks and attrition of your own aircraft and crew just in doing the practice for night operations because of the danger and risk, is because of the British experience at Jutland, where the Germans escaped at night. Basically, as I've said before, the Royal Navy has a lot of severe psychological trauma from World War One that it basically excises during World War Two. The fact that part of the training for midshipmen is that if they are the surviving officer on a bridge of a cruiser, they should be able to run a zigzag pattern. That's a requirement for a midshipman in this period. That if the senior surviving person on a bridge is a midshipman, they should be able to run a zigzag pattern of maneuver for a cruiser until another officer gets up there. That's the legacy of Abakur, Cressy, and Hogue, basically. The loss of those cruisers. And that's obsessive. To basically have as almost a criteria for your junior officers this. Now, I will say, that doesn't seem to be officially written down anywhere. But I've had enough diaries and enough senior officers discussing it and it seems to be quite clear it's a requirement. If a midshipman wants a posting to the bridge, they have to be able to do that. They will not get posted to the bridge, anywhere near the bridge, if they cannot do that. Which is pretty tough. Now, with that in mind, the Japanese aren't as focused on night operations as the British are. But they are focused on maximizing their aviation strength. And the idea of their aircraft being high speed and long range comes into this. Because what they want to do is they want to keep attacking and withdrawing, attacking and withdrawing, attacking and withdrawing. They want to withdraw to preserve their own strength, but they want to cause maximum damage before they withdraw. So they want to attrit the American forces as they advance. Basically, their idea is to sting the bear enough it comes charging towards them, and keep getting cuts in so often, but also of such a nature, the bear doesn't realize it's dying a death. That's their plan. It's not necessarily a good plan. It is a good plan if it works, but let's be honest, if you're a large enough power, you can withdraw. You can go, right, I've lost enough escorts, I've lost enough carriers, I've lost this, I'm going to have to withdraw my forces and rebuild and come back. And it really does work better on the Americans than it does on the British. Because if you think about it, yes, the British have the China Squadron, the China Station Force, and these things, but they're cruisers. They are light forces. Now, when you read through all this, and you think about all these sort of attacks and attrition that's going to happen, you then see this phrase at the bottom. The second and final phrase will be follow at daybreak, when the full weight of the main fleet will be thrown against the American fleet and annihilate it. There is your Kantai-Kessen. We'll be talking about the Kantai-Kessen more, because aircraft have a role in that as well. But the decisive battle, that's when you've already attrited your enemy forces, when you've already worn them down. That's the point of it. You're supposed to already reach the point at which they are no longer in a form at which they can fight efficiently and they can fight effectively. Or rather, at a point at which their parity with you, or close enough parity to you, means that your Taiken Kyoshugi, your individually more powerful ships, can provide enough of a force advantage that you can outweigh their quantitative advantage. That's the idea. But for that, you do need to have a significant qualitative advantage. And you need to have attrited the forces quite a lot. So again, this is the point of a lot of these scenarios, a lot of these purposes of this force structuring, and their doctrine of aviation, is that their aviation is to find the enemy, allow their submarines to find the enemy, allow their land-based aircraft and carrier-based aircraft to find the enemy, and attrit the enemy to the point at which you have dealt with especially the escorting forces enough. And this is where the Japanese are really interesting, because they do focus in far more on the escorting forces in some regards in this doctrine than the British and the Americans do with their Naval Aviation Doctrine. To allow for the fast battleships, cruisers and destroyers to deal a major blow in a night attack. That's where the Japanese do have their night fighting doctrine here comes in. It's the stage before you have the Kantai-Kessen. So you're basically having attrition by aviation and submarines. And then you have... Sorry. And then you have... Then come in. And then you have the night fighting capability come in. When the enemy are already weak, when they're already tired, when they've been deal with day in, day out attacks for maybe a week or so. When they've been constantly being attacked, suddenly at night they're going to have their horizon is going to erupt into a fireball of shells coming at them and of torpedoes, and that's the idea. And then the next, that force is then also going to withdraw. They're going to do damage and then withdraw. They're not there to fight a battle at night. They're there to attack at night and then go away. And then the next day, when you're recovering from all that, you're going to wake up to a dawn airstrike. It is all cornered around their ambush strategy, which is their core defensive strategy, really. Especially when it comes to island warfare, when it comes to a lot of their doctrines. The Yûgeki Sakusen, the ambush strategy, is the core point, and it's their oldest part of their strategy. And so you have Yûgeki Zengen Sakusen, interception and attrition operations, but yeah, that's all based on the foundation of Yûgeki Sakusen, the ambush strategy. And so that's when you have the Kantai-Kessen coming. Because once you've achieved the local superiority, and the idea is your local superiority, one of the interesting things about the Kantai-Kessen decisive battle is there is the idea amongst the Japanese, it might be fought against an enemy who is at that point starting to withdraw. That the enemy has pushed in, and they've had the night fight, and that's probably convinced them that they now need to get out, and they are now trying to withdraw, and as they're trying to withdraw, that's when you come in for the decisive battle. And I would say the vast majority of this strategy comes down to the thinking of Tetsutaro and how he structured the discussions, but also Yonai and Yamato, and of course the economic realities as expressed by Kurikyu. So yeah, I will admit I've reused some of my old slides from my previous video on Kantai-Kessen, etc. But there's a reason for that. The Japanese are very sensibly defining different phases of an operation. What is a Kantai-Kessen? Is it worthwhile carrying out a Kantai-Kessen? Are you able to bring a significant enough proportion of your forces to bear against a significant enough proportion of the enemy forces to bear? Because the whole point about the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, at the end of these operations, is that to provide them hopefully with enough of a shock they can actually get a negotiated settlement. Again, it's a limited war scenario. They can't win a total war against the British and the Americans. They know this, they understand this. The British Empire, too big. The Americans, too big. They're not stupid. Yes, they have a land, yes, they have glory, yes, they have honor, but they're not idiots. They also realize that any Kantai-Kessen is going to take significantly closer to Japan than they are necessarily going to be comfortable with. The Battle of Tsushima was a lot closer against the Russians to Japan than the Japanese were comfortable with. But it was necessary, it had to be fought there. They couldn't do attrition, they couldn't do anything they could to manage the forces. Luckily they didn't need to. Geography that absolutely evil, cantankerous dictator did the attrition for them on the Russians. That and the Russian economy and the Russian government. But leaving that to one side, what they want from their aviation assets as part of this and building up to this is to be able to attrit the enemy forces for minimal losses. The whole point is to inflict maximum damage for minimal loss, because they cannot afford to replace it as quickly. They're also structuring their forces around this scenario. They want to have very good, very cohesive forces which can work very well together as a solid force. When you're structuring things like the Kido Butai, when you're organizing the fleet, you're organizing it in such a way that you want to be able to deal with one concentrated threat. Because again, that is too much ocean for them to deal with a multitude of threats. The Americans showed us when they're doing their raiding operations, their carrier raids. And to be honest, it's in both the British and the American doctrines of how to fight a war in the Far East are carrier raids and carrier strike operations, using carrier task forces to dive in, launch a strike from far enough away and dive back. Why? Because they know the Japanese want to fight concentrated because that's their best chance, but if you can force the Japanese to break up their force, then they are a weakness. They are weaker. The Japanese both need you to be concentrated to allow them the maximum chance for their attrition to work, because again, if you're spread out over too wide an area, it's far more difficult to attrit the forces. Because you hit them, oh, we just found a cruiser task force, there's no carriers there. We just wasted everything hitting them. And we provided data that there's a carrier group within range of striking here, and where's the carrier task force? Whereas if you've got a whole battle fleet of carriers, capital ships, cruisers, destroyers, all concentrated together as mass, you go in and hit there, it's a target-rich environment. The odds are you're going to hit something. The odds are you're going to cause damage. Yes, it's going to be a stronger environment, which is going to demand more of your aircraft and more of your your aircrew, but it's also going to be an environment where you've got more targets to hit, and the more likelihood of hitting something valuable. So it's an interesting scenario of how they build up their aviation. It's a fusion strategy, truly. That's the best way to describe it. It's both got ideas of limited naval or limited war, and being able to fight a war at arm's length and keep the enemy away. And it's also guerrilla warfare. It is. It's attriting the enemy. It's got a heavy dose of psychological warfare in there as well, because ideally you're using your aviation assets to also provide a strike which will destroy the enemy's Asiatic fleet, to incense them enough that they come charging across. Now, I've had a discussion before when talking about Pearl Harbor, how for the Japanese it's both not successful enough and too successful. It's so successful the Americans cannot come charging straight across the ocean at them, so they can't attrit them, which is a problem, and also certainly does not wipe the Americans off the table, so it's definitely not successful enough either. It's an operation which goes too well for it to achieve its strategic aims, and not well enough for it to achieve a strategic superlative. Attacking the Philippines, though, there wasn't really enough there, you could argue. I would say potentially, if they had invaded the Philippines, if they then subjected it to air attack and airstrikes, taking out its aviation facilities, taking out its logistics facilities, and blockade, but carefully left long-range radio transmitters intact. I think the Americans would have had MacArthur squealing loudly. He needed support, so that might have caused the Americans to actually have to send a fleet, to relieve him. But I would add that the American Navy, and this is same true for the Royal Navy, British Empire, they understood the Japanese situation. They'd wargamed it. They knew exactly what the Japanese needed them to do to have a chance. And neither had any intention of playing into that game. The British, well, they have an offset strategy of their own, the night fighting capabilities of their aviation assets and their other vessel systems. But more importantly, the British strategic doctrine for going into the Far East is to concentrate at a theatre entry point, like Singapore, and then move up, taking places as you go, and funneling in reinforcements. The idea is basically, as troops come in from India, initially, from Britain, from Canada, from Australia, you do amphibious operations, you take more bases closer and closer to Japan until you've got in range of both your bombers and your fleet being able to conduct the required operations to inflict the blockade on Japan. And yeah, it's not a particularly dashing strategy on the part of the British. It's not full of elan, but it's perfectly serviceable, and it would have worked. Because again, the British were banking on certain advantages, i.e. if they took territory in China took it off the Chinese would probably assist them with taking it. And would probably be quite happy with the British saying, we want to garrison this while we're using it as a base, but it's your territory. Do you want to reinforce our garrison? Would you like some supplies? The American strategy, of course, was different because they were coming across the Pacific. The Americans have an island-hopping sort of strategy as how they're going to deal with it. And their idea is very much to take the islands as both bases for aircraft, but also as bases for repair and maintenance of their ships. Because the attrition strategy works as long as the Americans have to take all their ships back across the Pacific in order to get them repaired. If you can bring forward mobile basing systems and you can repair the ships as close to the area of theatre of operations as possible, that changes the reality. The Americans can sustain that. The British can sustain that. The Japanese can't with their infrastructure and economics. But yes, Japanese naval aviation strategy is all about information, and gathering and finding the enemy. It's also all about striking the enemy as hard, as often, and as quickly as possible. It's hit and run tactics. So, this video is nowhere near as long as it was originally planned to be. It really isn't. It's as long as I can make it with coughing. And it is going to end with a question, as the videos often do, but it's also going to end with a bit of a thank you, because I wouldn't be able to keep this going, I wouldn't be able to do all this without your support. I have to apologise. There were some late additions that came through to do with the patron vote, and so that's going to be sorted out, because I had something in there and then someone who was checking it for me, because I have my coughing means my brain's not always working properly, went, hang on, haven't you done something very similar to that question before? And I went, have I? Oh, I should probably put through a different question then. So, that happened, but almost went live, but didn't. But it'll go live soon. Today's topic question, well, it's a little bit different, but it's something which I want you to think about. If the Germans pursue a qualitative strategy for the naval race rather than a quantitative strategy. How do you think that changes ship design, with the Germans joining the Japanese, the British and the Americans and the Italians in the qualitative race for Dreadnought, the construction? How do you think that changes things? And how do you think that changes the growth of ship design and development of ships? I'm really interested to see what you think. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Japanese Naval Aviation Doctrine and how they approach naval aviation. I probably should discuss more about some of the defensive factors of it, but honestly, the overriding thing for it is offense. It's defensively offensive, if that makes sense. It's about attriting the enemy and working them down, and it's about doing that in repeated attacks that are designed to undermine both their morale to operate, but also their actual ability to operate. It is pretty much the only avenue they had. It's not a good avenue, but if you're looking at the Japanese strategic situation, if you're looking at the problems they faced and the reality of the world they were in, they don't have any good options. They have a massive dilemma, and this is the best solution, or rather the best worst option for them to pursue for a viability, a modicum of viability of defense. It's not a good idea, or a good doctrine maybe you can argue, but it's not a bad one either. It's the best worst option. So what have we got coming up? The War Experience Carriers and 801 Squadron and the USS Ranger, USS Wasp videos will come out on a Wednesday at some point. That will depend on my, how do I put this politely, on my recovery. I do apologise again. Getting pneumonia in both lungs is not fun. Thank you again for all your support. Thank you for all the super chats, the super thanks. Thank you for all the people buying books, the Ko-fi donations, the patrons. Thank you, everyone. It really makes a difference, and it's made it viable to keep doing this all when moving and being ill. I do feel guilty though, letting you all down by not keeping up my normal production rate, but I will get back to it as soon as I'm physically able to. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found this interesting, and hope you found this useful. Take care. Now, I'm just adding on a bit because one of the things I want to discuss in this video was the fact that how you deal with things like this, how you deal with books which are in a completely different language. Now, it used to be really difficult. It used to be a lot more difficult than it is today. Today, if you're like me, and most people are, you will have somewhere on your phone, probably, either, well, mine's an Android, so I have my Google app, and I have, if I go and press and touch on Google Lens, I can translate that to English. You can't really see that on the screen at this range, but that's pretty much what it's doing. And you can read. It does it fairly well and fairly quickly. So that's how we go through Japanese or language sources which we're not necessarily capable of translating as well on our own. Now, what I will say is what I also do is follow up that is I then send my translations through to a friend of mine who is Japanese and go, can you check this makes sense? And they usually come back to me and go, are you going to buy me a takeaway when we, are you going to buy me dinner when we next meet up? I go, yes. And then they send me a note saying whether it makes sense or not. It's a good system. But one of the things which you also have to add into when you're translating documents is you have to consider the culture and the scenario of the people you are dealing with. I love working with Japanese. I've worked with quite a few different nationalities over the years, and every nation has its own character, its own philosophy. This is one of the reasons why I enjoy the ship-shape trips so much, because we get to go and really understand. We sit, it's not just a case of visiting the naval museums. We also visit the churches. We visit a lot of cultural places while we're there. We try and, how do I put this? Put ourselves in a position to be exposed to as much of the national identity as we can while we're there. Because for every country, it views itself as the centre of its own world. It truly does. It might not express it. It's not going to be possibly an egotistical way that we are number one in the world. But for that country, for the people in that country, that country is the centre of their world, and that's how they view the rest of the world. This is one of the reasons why, again, Japan is quite so interesting as a strategic basis to discuss in the run-up to World War II in this scenario, because their approach is distinct and different from that of others, because they're coming from a different background. I've discussed it before. They had a successful World War I. They had their scenario, their aviation, their assets all worked well. So for them, the lessons coming out of World War I were to do more of the same, not that they needed to do massive changes. And that's part of the problems for them in World War II, because of the differentials. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. I thought I'd make it a premiere because that allows me to chat with people, and if I'm not coughing too much, I will attempt to be on Discord after this to chat with you all. Anyone who wants to join, I'll be in the general chat on the Discord server. Link to that is down below, and thank you again for all your support, and as said, the Patreon vote should be live.